the new NAFTA is certainly not a good agreement. It's not going to create jobs. It's not even going to stop the outsourcing. It's on the margin and improvement. It will stop a bunch of bad ISDS cases. But the way to think about it is it's a new floor. It's no template going forward, but it's a new floor we can fight from. Because up until now, our agreements have had all these big pharma giveaways, and we haven't had any kind of labor and environmental standards to speak of, and they've all had ISDS. So we fixed some things relative to the original NAFTA, and now we have a big fight going forward to actually get to agreements we'd want and like. Versus in the case of the NAFTA fight, it was about limiting the damage of a terrible agreement and now making it a not very good agreement.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friends, and thank you for listening to the 209th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. If you are new to Congressional Dish, if this is your first time listening to this show, this is a show about what Congress does and how it affects us peasants. And for the last few weeks, I've been focusing on war, and today we're going to take a break from that in order to get some information about the new NAFTA, which is one of our country's most important international treaties. It's been in effect since the 90s, and it was just changed by the Trump administration. And those changes were approved and made into U.S. law by this Congress just a few weeks ago. Now, when I sat down to check out this new trade agreement, I realized very quickly that I was totally out of my league on this one because I was 12 years old when the original NAFTA became law, and so I wasn't really up on the deets. And so to compare the old NAFTA to the new NAFTA, which is about 800 pages long, I just sat there and realized that I don't even know where to start. But I did know someone who knows this stuff better than just about anyone else on this planet, and so I asked Lori Wallach, the director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, to come on the show to explain to me and to you what just went down and how this trade agreement was changed and how it affects us. And lucky for all of us, she did. Now, Public Citizen, the organization that she works for, is a consumer advocacy organization with about 500,000 members that prides itself on resisting corporate power. And one of my favorite things about Public Citizen, and one of the main reasons why this listener-supported podcaster trusts them, is that they don't take any government or corporate money. In fact, the tagline on their website says, quote, "Corporations have their lobbyists in Washington, D.C. The people need advocates too," unquote, and amen. Now, Public Citizen was created by Ralph Nader in 1971, and so it had been operating for over 20 years by the time that the World Trade Organization came into existence. Because after World War II, if you're not familiar with the World Trade Organization, the victors of that war wanted to create a global economic system that would govern the economics running on the theory that countries that trade with each other don't go to war with one another. And so if we're all in the same system, then there would be no more war. Hasn't really worked out the way they planned. But the point is that there were always meant to be three main institutions governing the world economy. And they got two out of the three right away. They got the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund right after World War II. But it took until 1995 for the main institution, the World Trade Organization, to come into existence. That same year, I'm sure not at all coincidentally, Public Citizen created their Global Trade Watch division that focuses on globalization and specifically international trade agreements. Global Trade Watch's mission is to ensure, quote, "a majority have the opportunity to enjoy economic security, a clean environment, safe food, medicines and products, access to quality, affordable services such as healthcare, and the exercise of democratic decision-making about the matters that affect our lives," unquote. And Lori is in charge of the Global Trade Watch division. She's been doing this for over 25 years. Now, Lori Wallach first popped up on my radar when I saw her on C-SPAN testifying to Congress about global trade issues from the peasant perspective. She was making the arguments that I would have made. And some of you longtime dishers might recognize her voice from when I played some media clips of her talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership way back in 2013. And so she's been helping me, I mean, not directly, but she has been helping me understand this international trade stuff for a long time. And so when I went to Netroots Nation, which is a conference of like lefty people in 2016, and I saw that she was speaking there, I made sure to go up after her talk to thank her. And I wasn't expecting this, but she invited me out for a beer with her and her team, which of course I went. And everything said during that strategy session that I was fortunate enough to sit in on was off the record. But I can tell you this much. You know, when you see someone on television or you're familiar with someone's work and then you get to meet them and see what they're like behind the scenes in real life and they surpass your expectations? Well, that's what happened. I just really, really liked her. She was blunt and funny and so smart. And just being around her made me think that it was possible to take on the corporate titans because she's been doing it for years and it hasn't killed her yet. And so I didn't know if she'd be willing to come on the show and talk to me. And I'm so happy that she did because like I said, I was out of my league and I really wanted her to explain what the hell went down with Nafta 2.0 or the USMCA. That's the real abbreviation for the version that was just signed into law. And I wanted her to explain it to me in her classic no bullshit style like she did when we were having those beers. And boy, did she. And so I'm so excited to share this interview with you because I learned so much, not only about this trade agreement, but about the system and where we stand in it. Now, I know that for relatively new listeners, some of this conversation is going to be kind of inside baseball. And so in this episode's show notes, I have a few old Congressional Dish episodes listed for you that will give you the information that you'll need to be in the know for this conversation. Although I do think you'll be fine without them if you don't want to go that deep down the rabbit hole. But if you want to get the most out of this interview, the two Congressional Dish episodes in particular that are going to give you the really important context are Congressional Dish 96, which is fast tracking fast track, and Congressional Dish 102, which was about the World Trade Organization. If you listen to those episodes, I think you'll be pretty much caught up with me, which I'm pretty green on all this stuff myself, but we all have to start somewhere. Also, in this episode's show notes are sources. So, for example, when Lori lists a bunch of crazy repeals of laws that the investor-state dispute settlement system had led to, I have more information for you so that you can start your own rabbit hole adventures. I also have a bunch of congressional reports, and I have links, of course, to Public Citizen and the Global Trade Watch websites where you can get additional information or, even better, get involved. And as always, there are also links to donate to Congressional Dish because this podcast is listener supported. We don't take corporate money here either. And everyone who contributes on Patreon in particular will get access to my interview with Lori uncensored and uncut. Although I do have to tell you that we really didn't cut much because the whole conversation was so valuable. But if you value this information and the work that I do, 2020 is starting off real rough. So please contribute using any method of your choice on congressionaldish.com. Okay. Now, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Lori Wallach of Global Trade Watch. I hope you enjoy this interview as much as I did. How are you?
I am good, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks. Thanks so much for joining me. Do you remember me by any chance?
I'm going to be embarrassed and say I don't. Remind me how we knew each other.
Totally fair. I met you at Netroots Nation in 2016, and I totally fangirled all over you after your talk. And you invited me for a beer with your team just right across the street. And so I just stood there and sat there with you guys and, I don't know, fangirled even harder to myself. But yeah, I'm so excited to talk to you again about all of this new NAFTA stuff because I tried to tear into it myself and I felt completely out of my league. So thank you so much for joining me today.
I just Googled your picture and I do recognize you. What do you know? Nice to see you again.
Thank you. Nice to talk to you again. I'm going to jump right into it. The first thing I want to start with is I just kind of want to gut check myself when it comes to international trade agreements to make sure I understand what's going on. So when I think of these international trade agreements, what I see going on big picture is that there's a economic system that is intended to be global, that is being administered through the World Trade Organization. And from what I understand with these international trade agreements, they are what are assimilating the different countries into that economic system run by the WTO. Do I have that correct?
Basically, the way it works is previous to the WTO and NAFTA, trade agreements were literally about trade, cutting border taxes called tariffs and opening up limits on the amount of goods, quotas. And the only thing trade agreements covered were actually moving goods between countries. If you couldn't drop something on your foot, it wasn't covered in the trade agreement. The big transformation comes with the WTO and Nafta, where suddenly you have a scenario similar to what you just described, where a whole set of non-trade rules, including all kinds of behind-the-border policies with respect to consumer instability regulations of banks and insurance companies, with respect to the safety of food and products, with respect to things like even how states can spend their tax dollars in acts of government procurement. Can they require procurers meet certain labor standards or environmental standards? And issues as unrelated to trade as things like, well, sort of the antithesis. Instead of free trade, protection with monopoly patents for big pharmaceutical companies, which from Econ 101 is sort of the classic rent-seeking protectionist device as a monopoly license to basically create rents, extra payments to a license holder. So all of these things unrelated to trade get put into the NAFTA and the World Trade Organization. And all of these agreements have a rule that's the most important to understand. Someplace in each of these agreements is something like what is in the WTO agreement, which is each country shall ensure the conformity of all domestic laws, regulations, and administrative procedures with the attached agreements. What that kind of clause means practically is every country has to change its domestic laws to meet this one-size-fits-all set of rules, negotiated behind closed doors, not in countries' domestic parliaments, and basically set up a regime that is a in for a dime, in for a dollar adoption of a package of what, when the WTO was established in the 90s, would be called the neoliberal policy package. So deregulate finance and privatize services like education and healthcare, limit regulation of energy and transport, create new investor rights and intellectual property monopolies for big companies, and limit the role of government in the economy. And if you fail to do that under the WTO, you're subject to trade sanctions. So there are a lot of international treaties on the environment, labor rights, but there are conventions. And the convention basically sets out substantive rules countries agree to, but they're not enforceable. The enforcement is the Endangered Species Treaty. We all agree that's the list of endangered critters, but every country has to enforce it domestically. So the Endangered Species Act in the U.S. says we won't import this stuff. But WTO, the NAFTA, and a variety of other agreements, what those agreements have are internationally binding, enforceable rules, because a country can charge another country of not having conformed their domestic laws and go to a tribunal built into the agreement, and the tribunal is authorized to impose indefinite trade sanctions, billions of dollars in penalties, if a country doesn't dump its non-conforming law. And that is how the U.S. got rid of things as untrade related as country of origin meat labeling. Notice the last 3 years in the grocery store, it's gone. That was WTO legal. Or Clean Air Act rules about the cleanliness of gasoline that were created to avoid the crisis of Amazon clusters with kids in cities, WTO legal. Or the ban we had in imports of tuna fish caught with nets that drown dolphins. No, can't do that. Can't even label it the right way. WTO illegal. And that's happened to countries around the world. India's ban on patenting of life forms and medicines, given it's a very poor country with a lot of people, that's WTO illegal. EU rules having to do with limits on genetically modified foods, that's WTO illegal. So it has been, in a very elegant way, a way for corporate rigged rules to be imposed pretty much one size fits all, enforceably worldwide.
Okay, so when I think of this, so I actually wasn't taking it far enough. I was thinking of it as an economic system, but it's actually far more than that.
It's legal, it's policy, it's political. And the way it was certainly, the way you think about it is how a lot of very smart people think about it. They hear the word trade agreement and they think, oh, that must have to do with things going across borders. And that's a very popular brand. Free trade. Who's not for free trade? So it's a very clever marketing strategy that a lot of very big multinational companies had the notion in the basically late 1980s, but peaking in the beginning of the 90s, to find a method to impose these rules unrelated to trade, limiting basic food safety and financial and other regulations, imposing longer monopolies for pharmaceutical corporations, things that weren't doing well in the democratic venues of parliaments and state legislatures. They found a sort of backdoor way to impose it. And they adopted that brand, free trade agreement. But I often think that David Ricardo and Adam Smith must be rotating in their graves to see the concept that had to do with limiting border taxes and limiting quotas and comparative advantage in the trade of goods. Somehow that brand has been applied to, I don't know, having the clearest protectionist monopoly licensing system of like textbook rent-seeking protections for intellectual property for patents to raise medicine prices because there's no competition. That is the reality.
Okay, so that makes me feel better. It makes me feel a little less like Alex Jones. Because when you talk about this just out in the world, no one thinks about trade agreements. In fact, that's one of the most stunning things for me to watch the way the USMCA became law. It happened the same week that we funded the government and we impeached the president. And like, oh, by the way, we passed this international trade agreement and that got almost no coverage. So that was really shocking to me. And so I want to turn towards, the new Nafta, which I guess is what most people are calling it. What triggered this rewrite? What was wrong with the original Nafta that the Trump administration, which is, in my opinion, one of the most corporate administrations fathomable, why did they rewrite NAFTA and who did they have making these new rules?
So on the one hand, they rewrote NAFTA because there has been a long-standing antipathy by Donald Trump to the NAFTA and the data of its outcomes. More than 1 million jobs certified as lost to NAFTA, certified by the U.S. Department of Labor, supports his sort of gut instinct hunch it was a bad idea. But his notion of why it was a bad idea and what needed to be fixed in it was pretty much bass-ackwards. It wasn't that the U.S. got taken advantage of by Mexico. Our negotiators just weren't smart enough. That's a crock. In fact, most of the worst things in the original NAFTA that promoted job outsourcing, that pushed down wages, that wiped out millions of family farmers in Mexico and hundreds of thousands in the U.S., those are all things pushed by the United States of America in the NAFTA negotiations. And that's because NAFTA, the original, was negotiated under a system where there are 500 official U.S. corporate advisors. That's under the so-called fast track system, where Congress delegated its constitutional Article 1.8 authority over trade, its exclusive authority. Nixon got Congress to give a lump sum delegation so that the fast track authority basically gives the president a blank check to negotiate trade agreements and sign them and enter into them before Congress ever gets to vote on it. And instead of Congress having that role, the trade-off was a whole slew of private sector interests would have official access to the texts that are kept secret to the public, the press, Congress, etc. So the original NAFTA, and this also gets to how the WTO got so lopsided. He or she who pays the piper calls the tune. So all these companies were right there at the table, and there weren't representatives for consumer groups and environmental groups or a handful of labor unions mixed in with the 500 corporate advisors. So the original NAFTA was the U.S. imposing these corporate rig rules on the rest of North America. And we didn't get taken advantage of in the sense of country to country, but all of us got screwed by a bunch of corporate lobbyists basically writing the rules. So in comes Trump, and his initial notion of what to do to fix it is as ill-informed as his critique of how it got broke. But the good news was the only good cabinet member in the entire Trump administration happens to be the trade representative. He's a guy named Robert Lighthizer. He's worked with unions for a long time. The president didn't know his ass from his elbow on these issues, but Lighthizer did. And so happily, Lighthizer sat down with unions and Democrats and Congress, and there was certainly a lot of difference. So there's not 100% agreement even with this guy and Democrats. But there was enough overlap that they could agree on some things, like what were the main incentives actually promoting outsourcing, making it easier and cheaper in NAFTA. One of them was the corporate tribunals, the investor state dispute settlement tribunals, and the outrageous special privileges for foreign investors. And the Democrats in Congress and the trade representative agreed that stuff had to go. It put the Republicans in Congress in a total snit. They went bonkers because the corporations wanted those outsourcing subsidies effectively to stay in NAFTA. On the other hand, there are plenty of ways in which what the trade representative wanted to do was not going to be good for consumers and workers. So, cut to the chase. The deal that they announced and that Donald Trump signs, the new NAFTA, which we called NAFTA 2.0 in 2018, that agreement has some improvements. But there's some really bad news stuff, like, additional extra protections for big pharma to lock in high medicine prices here and to raise medicine prices in Mexico and Canada, or special new protections to limit Congress's ability to regulate the big tech platforms. Plus, there's all kinds of stuff that just only kind of half done. So there were some improvements on labor and environmental standards, but it wasn't enforceable, and there were also huge loopholes, like the kind of loophole where like the loophole eats the provision kind of loopholes. But there was, it wasn't bad intentions in those chapters. It just wasn't right. So then this big standoff ensues. The Democrats win the House, obviously. So the deal that was signed in 2018 was done after the Democrats won the House. I think Trump just thought, well, I'll just steamroller them.
Yeah, wasn't it like 2 weeks, within 2 weeks of the election, something like that?
They signed it, and, a variety of people basically said in advance, that thing is DOA in a Democratic House. These folks are not going to have won a majority saying to bring down medicine prices and then say, oh, and look, some new handcuffs. Let us voluntarily put them on and throw away the key, because these NAFTA provisions will keep us from ever changing the crappiest policies that now keep generic medicines from being on the market quickly, the competition that brings down prices. Yeah, we're going to sign up for that right away. Well, it took a year.
Sorry to interrupt. Are you talking about the patent protections?
That's right. So in the new NAFTA that Trump signed in 2018, they added new monopoly rights for big pharma that would have locked in the exact policies that the Democrats in Congress promised that they're going to change, that they have passed laws changing, and that Mitch McConnell, the Grim Reaper, is sitting on not getting through the Senate. But it is the case that these newly majority Democrats in Congress looked at this trade agreement Trump signed, and they're looking at it and saying, why would he think it's a good idea to sign this after we just won a majority saying that we're going to take on big pharma and bring down medicine prices? We're not signing a deal that is rigged by big pharma to make it impossible to do what needs to be done to make sure consumers can have affordable medicines. And we're sure as hell not going to export our shitty system to Mexico and Canada. And so an entire year of standoff ensues where another 60,000 jobs get outsourced. The trade deficit goes to the ceiling. Instead of opening up the NAFTA 2.0 from 2018 and taking out that big pharma garbage and finishing, improving the labor and environmental standards, which obviously are half the fix for stopping outsourcing. I mean, you get rid of the investor outsourcing incentives. Okay, that's half the deal. But if you can still, as a U.S. company, go to Mexico, where the law basically for decades has been such that fake unions can come in before the first worker is hired, sign a contract with some big U.S. company that guarantees low wages. These, they call them protection unions or yellow contract unions. They sign a deal that locks in low wages. It's so bad that at this point, wages in Mexico in manufacturing are 40% lower than in China.
Oh, wow.
They are lower in real terms than before NAFTA 25 years ago, which itself is disgusting given the price of everything's gone up. But they are 40% cheaper than China manufacturing. And that's because of these rigged fake contracts. So like guys at Goodyear go into a brand new $800 million plant. Goodyear, the U.S. corporation, tire corporation, puts into San Luis Potosí in Mexico. And guys are getting hurt because they don't have the safety protections. People are being paid $1.80 an hour.
Oh.
Their counterparts in the U.S. are getting paid between $25 and $30 an hour to make the exact same tire. The guys and gals in Mexico are working just as hard, making just as good tires, $1.80. So they go on strike. And a whole bunch of them get fired and a couple of them go to jail. And, they're thinking, what the hell? We have a constitutional right in Mexico to have a strike. Well, it turns out, unbeknownst to all the workers in the brand new fancy plant, there was a fake union contract signed by one of these fake unions, and they were now violating their contract. They didn't know they had signed that locked in bad wages and no health and safety protections. So all these people could be legally fired. The people who are seen as the agitators could be arrested. And that kind of active suppression of wages was not in any way fixed in the deal, the Nafta 2.0 that got signed in 2018. So after a year of skirmishes where the House Democrats basically said, finish the job on labor and environment, get rid of the outrageous pharma stuff, and by the way, no rollbacks on the things you did that were real improvements, there finally was a new NAFTA. So NAFTA 2.0 goes into the recycling bin. I have a printed out copy because it doesn't exist anymore. Mexico and Canada have to sign a new NAFTA. And the deal in 2019, actually, though certainly not a good agreement, actually could limit some of NAFTA's ongoing harm. Because that's the deal with an agreement like this. I mean, you're trying to figure out how to limit ongoing damage. New investor state corporate attacks against environmental laws getting filed every month, more outsourcing every week. You're trying to think of how do I limit some of that damage? But trying to stop the ruin of a bad agreement continuing is a whole different thing than creating a good agreement.
So it sounds to me like you don't hate the new one that became law. What were some of the positive things in it?
Well, what might be the single biggest thing is whacking the investor state dispute settlement system.
No, they did?
They did. So that investor state dispute settlement, for listeners who aren't familiar with it, it's a system that corporations love, that NAFTA was the first agreement to have, where there's a whole set of substantive extra privileges and rights for foreign investors that a signatory country has to offer. And then the foreign investor can privately enforce all these new privileges and rights by going to tribunals of 3 corporate attorneys skirting domestic courts. And the attorneys can order governments to pay unlimited taxpayer-funded compensation to the multinational corporations for any claimed violation of the new investor rights created by a new environmental law, a health regulation, a government action. The kind of examples under NAFTA that have led to $400 million being paid out are things like a U.S. mining company wants to put a quarry and a shipping export terminal right smack in the middle of a pristine bay in Nova Scotia. And not surprisingly, like would be done here, there's an environmental impact statement required. And the environmental impact statement comes back and it says, no, the damage to local native fisheries and rivers and the migrating whale species that's in this particular bay, they want to put the terminal. And by the way, the mining itself is going to cause problems in XYZ and the community is against it. And here are all the health and safety risks. And this mining company basically attacks that as a violation of its NAFTA right to invest, right to mine. And they win the case. And they get paid Canadian taxpayer bucks so that basically the governments are under this chilling effect of don't do anything or else. And or when they do something, they have to pay. So another classic case, Canada banned a toxic gasoline additive. The U.S. corporation comes in, attacks it under the NAFTA investor state system. In that case, because the damages are going to be huge, Canada says, all right, we give up. We'll reverse it. We'll allow this toxic chemical. And the company says, well, that's not good enough. You still have to pay us $23 million plus. We want you to run ads around the world saying it's safe so other countries buy it too. Those kind of attacks, another classic one, metal-clad cases. Another one is Mexican toxic waste dump. U.S. company wants to set up shop. Mexican government says, as they had said to the Mexican owner of this toxic waste dump before the U.S. owner bought it, hey, it's closed down. You bought it as a brownfield, closed down. There's a reason it doesn't have any operating permits. The containment pits are all leaking. You got it real cheap. You got to fix it up before we can give you an operating permit. Seems fair. It's treating them the same as the Mexican owners. U.S. company says, under no circumstances. We have a Nafta right to operate. Give us the permit or give us the cash. They got the cash. So those kind of outrageous cases have been the bane of NAFTA. And the new NAFTA totally eliminates what is technically NAFTA Chapter 11B. So the investment state system is whacked. And with respect to Canada, it's gone forever, which is really important because almost all of the bad NAFTA and ISDS cases have been U.S. corporations attacking Canada. There's that one Mexican case on the toxic waste dump, but all the other ones are U.S. firms attacking Canada.
Well, we did lose the country of origin labels one because that's what put all of this on my radar was when we lost the ISDS case for beef and pork products. And now Congress didn't really fight it. They just decided to change our law, which is one of the reasons I got so upset with this system existing because it doesn't force us to change our laws, but it kind of does unless we want to pay that fine. So this does, even though it hasn't classically affected us, it can.
That's different. That system, you're exactly right about that case. That's the one I was mentioning about the country of origin meat labels. That's a WTO case. So that's the system I was talking about where one government can attack another government, and then you have to change the law or you face trade sanctions. So you're exactly right. Mexico and Canada attacked the U.S., but at the WTO, not in NAFTA, and it wasn't an investor. It was the official governments.
Okay.
And they said, hey, you haven't conformed your laws to the rules. And then the U.S. said, all right, well, what are you going to do about it if the WTO says we violated the WTO? And Mexico and Canada said, we're going to put up $3 billion of trade sanctions against your imports every damn year until you get rid of the law. And so they did. Congress got rid of the law.
Okay, so these are two very different things. There's ISDS provisions in NAFTA and in the WTO. Does that mean that they're also in some of these other trade agreements that we have?
So the WTO doesn't have ISDS. Free trade agreements like NAFTA have it. And most of our free trade agreements, like with Korea, Colombia, have ISDS. We don't have ISDS with our free trade agreements with Israel and with Australia. And what would have been a huge expansion of the ISDS corporate powers would have been the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is why it was so important that agreement was not approved by Congress. Congress just sat and let it die. They couldn't get a majority of it. And that happened well before Donald Trump was president. He came in and boxed and buried the moldering corpse that had already been dying there for a year after it was signed and couldn't get through Congress. In a certain way, ISDS is almost worse than the government-to-government enforcement like at WTO that killed the country of origin meat labels, because it empowers every individual corporation to literally have equal status with an entire nation state, to privately enforce public treaty rights against the government and extract unlimited taxpayer dollars. These cases aren't subject to appeal for any purported violation of these extraordinary investor rights granted in the agreement. So the new NAFTA totally shreds that system. It's gone. It ended. It is over between the U.S. and Canada.
Wow.
And with respect to Mexico, it replaces investor-state dispute settlement with a new system that largely comports with what progressive advocates have demanded as if you're going to have investor rights, this is what it should be. So first of all of the most extreme rights that the cases have all paid out under, basically rules that limit the right to regulate, all of those rules are removed. The only rights for investors are if their property is actually physically expropriated, then you can get compensation. The government takes your thing. You can get compensation. And also, if after you've been set up, there's an act of discrimination directly against you as a foreign investor, you can make a claim. But the right to invest, eliminated. The right to be free of regulatory changes, eliminated. The right to have what are called performance standards, conditions on investors, reestablished. The right to limit transfers of capital, reestablished. Huge whacking of corporate power. And the most interesting thing is, under this new regime, you can't use even those limited rights unless you've spent 30 months in the domestic courts and administrative system trying to solve your problem domestically. It's called domestic exhaustion. So you can't have the scenario anymore where the bully corporation says, I'm going to go to an investor state tribunal and you better give me whatever I want or else. There are no threats. You have to spend 2.5 years trying to solve your problem domestically before you can try and get compensation for, say, the expropriation of your property that wasn't compensated. And then there are other changes like no rotating between being a tribunalist and suing governments as a lawyer. You pick one side. Or the damages can't be expected future profits, inherently speculative damages, which the old system allowed. So that's by far the biggest single improvement. And it also sends a signal worldwide, given the U.S. had been the big pusher of investor-state dispute settlement, that it's a different world on ISDS. The other good things are there's a very good labor rights annex that basically requires Mexico within 4 years to replace all those fake contracts with real ones that the workers actually vote and approve. It's a binding standard of the agreement. It's subject to trade sanctions. And there's a special enforcement system called rapid response labor enforcement, specifically to try and force implementation of that provision. It's a powerful set of rules and a powerful tool if you have a trade ambassador who wants to use it. There are loopholes. It's not all it could have been, but it certainly is an improvement and could make a difference for our brothers and sisters in Mexico being able to fight for better wages.
Is there any kind of minimum wage requirement for them, or is it still allowed to be negotiated on a company by company level?
Company by company level. But one of the other things I was going to mention is an interesting and innovative provision that's in there, but the actual technical way it's written isn't going to make a difference, is there is a provision that requires a certain portion of the value of goods in order to get the benefits of the free trade agreement have to be made by workers making on average $16 an hour. Now, the problem is the way it's written. As a recovering trade attorney, I looked at this and thought, oh, how clever, a minimum wage standard. And then I read the details and I went, oh, how sneaky. It doesn't matter because the standard is not 40% of the value of a car and 45% of the value of a truck must be made by a worker making $16 an hour. Instead, it says must be made by workers who on average make $16 an hour. And then you look at the footnote, and the footnote allows you to average in salaried employees that do technical work like engineering, et cetera. So you could still have line workers assembling the cars in Mexico making $3 an hour and average in a bunch of $80,000 a year engineers, and you come up with the right number. But it's an interesting concept. It just doesn't work the way you'd want to actually raise wages in this particular agreement.
I mean, I guess it's better than what we had before, though, right?
I say that's right. There's some interesting concepts in this agreement that if they were written slightly differently are actually good tools. I mean, politically, the fact that this agreement passed with all the Republicans supporting it.
Yeah, how did that happen?
Well, except for a couple of total, ideological free trade lunatics, like Senator Toomey basically had a big temper tantrum on the floor. It's sort of worth looking at his floor statement. This is outrageous. The investor state dispute settlement is gutted. Thousands of U.S. oil and gas companies in Mexico have lost rights that they originally had. And by the way, there is a bad loophole in that what is generally a good story in investment. There's a loophole that protects old investor state rights for 9 U.S. corporations that had 13 oil field contracts from the partial privatization. It's a loophole. It's a problem. But he was in a rage because thousands of companies had investor rights. And now it's just down to this handful of companies who are grandfathered in. And how outrageous that there be labor rights in a trade agreement, and how outrageous that there's a percentage of domestic content that is required, and it can't be goods from China that get these benefits. But generally what happened is all these Democrats are on record for a deal that doesn't have the big pharma giveaways. Those had to be taken out. That doesn't have investor state, and that does have labor and environmental standards, with the labor ones actually subject to enforcement. That's a big shift.
That's a huge shift. And where did we land on those patent protections? Because I know that in the US, they're protected for 12 years. Canada was 8 and Mexico was 5, if I have that correct. Where did they land?
Yep. And so they're not patent protections. The patent protections are 20 years.
Ooh.
And the thing you're talking about, because you have the numbers exactly right, those are exclusivity rights, marketing and data exclusivity rights for a particular category of drugs that are called biologic medicines. So in the WTO, one of those outrageous, not about trade, protectionist, corporate favoring goodies is every country in the WTO, which the US, Mexico, and Canada are all in the WTO, must have 20-year patent terms. Just to put this in perspective, before the WTO, the US had a 17-year patent for medicines. So we had to give extra protections to the pharma companies, which just for the drugs that were in patent for the companies when the WTO went into effect in 1995, the University of Minnesota School of Pharmacology said it cost the U.S. $6 billion additional dollars just for Medicare and Medicaid extra expenses for the increase in drug prices caused by that.
Oh.
So then the Nafta went further, and the new Nafta went even further. So the new Nafta basically would have required, as you said, locking in 10-year exclusivity rights in addition to the patents for these cutting-edge cancer and diabetes and other drugs, the biologic medicines. That meant even if the patent was up, for another 10 years, the companies would basically have the right to hold on to the data so generic medicines couldn't be made, or if the data was available, to have what's called marketing exclusivity, where you couldn't sell the meds. So they could have a monopoly price for an extra 10 years.
Yeah.
Plus, in the new NAFTA were things like rules that required countries to allow an extra 20-year patent for a new use of a known chemical entity.
Ooh.
So you already got your 20 years, but then you get another 20 years if you realize that a hair growth drug also was a great erectile dysfunction drug. Oh, that happened. It's called Viagra.
Or like Botox is good for headaches now.
Yeah, exactly. And they get another patent. That was in there. It's called patent evergreening. There are a bunch of other very sneaky provisions. All that stuff got whacked. That was a total victory. USTR just had to totally give up and back off of all that stuff. So the new NAFTA is certainly not a good agreement. It's not going to create jobs. It's not even going to stop the outsourcing. It's on the margin and improvement. It will stop a bunch of bad ISDS cases. But the way to think about it is it's a new floor. It's no template going forward, but it's a new floor we can fight from. Because up until now, our agreements have had all these big pharma giveaways, and we haven't had any kind of labor and environmental standards to speak of, and they've all had ISDS. So we fixed some things relative to the original NAFTA, and now we have a big fight going forward to actually get to agreements we'd want and like. Versus in the case of the NAFTA fight, it was about limiting the damage of a terrible agreement and now making it a not very good agreement.
Where did it land on the environment? Because I read back in the TPP years, when they leaked those 3 chapters, I read the environment chapter, which was basically loophole after loophole. Like it was the weakest thing I've ever read in my life. Did we actually get any good environmental protections out of this? Because you did say the Democrats were working on labor, environment, and pharmaceuticals. What did they get for the environment? So the environmental language is certainly better than the original NAFTA, but it's not the big progress that certainly is necessary. And it didn't say anything about climate, which is really pretty obscene in the middle of a climate crisis. So the upside is there are stronger standards. They're in the core text, and they're subject to the same enforcement as the rest of the agreement, which certainly was not the case, say, for the original NAFTA. The problem is that the language that is not sort of that core boilerplate language is really weaselly. So there are lots of pages, but as you said, there are lots of loopholes. So, it's things, instead of saying things like countries shall ensure marine mammals are not harassed, encircled, or otherwise
Endangered, it says things like, countries shall strive to take measures that protect the future health and happiness of marine mammals. Well, what the hell does that mean? If you shall strive means you basically put up a poster of Flipper and you've striven.
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean you have to actually do anything.
But you have to try.
But you have to try. But the thing is, the actual core the core environmental standards now are in there. And that is basically some important technical improvements got forced in the labor standards. Things like flipping the burden of proof. Like there were always weaselly loopholes in the standards that, for instance, you had to prove something was trade related, or you had to prove a pattern of action. And so now the burden is flipped. It's presumed to be trade related unless the company who's being challenged can prove, the country being challenged can prove it isn't. And the labor unions fought for that. The environmental movement just from day one did not engage. And so a lot of the places where the labor movement engaged and got improvements, that got grafted into the environmental chapter because the Democrats in Congress basically forced the administration to do it. But the environmental movement was not sort of engaging to fight for specific changes. So the basic standard is improved in part because the unions forced some of the technical changes, and then there weren't any standards on the environment in NAFTA. And there are a couple of places where the Democrats basically left docking space to add in, say, a reference to the Paris Agreement. But this agreement's silent on climate, which is absurd in the era of climate crisis. And there's no special enforcement for the environmental standards versus the unions basically forced the Democrats in Congress to not allow a vote in the agreement until they got special enforcement for the labor standards. So the environment standards are weaker than the labor standards, and there's nothing on climate.
Okay, so a missed opportunity there. Is there a chance to improve this without rewriting it, or are we kind of set in stone until, I don't even know what until? How do we improve this going forward?
Well, there are a couple of different things. The first thing is the new NAFTA won't go into effect until the countries have made various policy changes and done the things needed to implement it. So it's not likely to go into effect until closer to the end of this year. But the thing that's going to happen first is the administration is now considering negotiating agreements with the UK and with Kenya. Basically, for trade activists, the most important opportunity to build on the progress that was made in the NAFTA renegotiation is to basically, in the context of the Kenya and the UK agreements, to make clear what Democrats in Congress have said, what public citizens have said, what the unions have said, which is, okay, we may have made some progress in the NAFTA, slowing down its damage, but it ain't no template.
Yeah.
For a new agreement written from scratch, where the question is either no badness or something good, we ain't going for something that's less badness. Because if not having it means no badness, why do we have less badness?
Yeah.
So standard for the new agreements is where we really need to now focus the fight. And the Democrats in Congress, still having a majority, are in a position basically to leverage that majority on those agreements to now take the next steps to improve further the environmental and labor standards, or as I think is probably going to happen, to say, hey, no climate standards, no deal. So if Mr. Climate Denier wants to have a trade agreement, he's going to have to suck it up and deal with climate standards, or you just ain't getting a deal. And that kind of hardball is how the Democrats got the outrageous pharma giveaways taken out of the new NAFTA. Even in the first round of negotiations, that kind of, we won't have an agreement that has ISDS. Now, in that case, the trade representative agreed with that perspective, but those kind of bright lines are what trade activists need to help Congress to discern. And to that end, we're launching actually a new campaign and project called Rethink Trade. If you go to tradewatch.org, you can see all of the data. You can search job losses from NAFTA for your community. We have, through a standing lawsuit, Freedom of Information Act lawsuit, we have all the data. We have made it searchable, et cetera. You can look at what the NAFTA impacts in your communities have been. You can look at, we have a really interesting side by side of original NAFTA, NAFTA 2.0, the final New Deal. So you can see what is and isn't fixed. But this next step is rethink trade. Let's not just try and minimize the damage of the crappy old model. let's think about what we want. Because right now, with all these agreements they want to negotiate, it's a blank slate. If we don't think it's better than not having the agreement, we just stop the new agreements. But let's fight for what we really want as the model going forward. And if there's a new Democratic progressive president in 2021, we sure as heck need to make sure that the future U.S. trade agreements are actually what the good progressive model that's about actually raising wages, that's about improving the environment, that's about raising consumer health and safety standards, making sure that companies can't play countries off of each other with wages or pushing down food or financial regulations, but that rather there's a floor of decency established in the trade agreements. And if the companies want to play, that's where the territory is. You get up to that level and countries can go higher, but there's a floor. Right now with these trade agreements, there's a ceiling. You have a better standard than is allowed in the trade agreement, you get whacked. But there's no floor. You don't have to do anything. That's the difference.
Yeah. And I really agree with that too, because when I have these conversations about, the global government and I sound all Alex Jones, it's like some people will freak out that there is a global system being created, but we kind of need to have rules on a global scale where we have these multinational corporations, but it matters who writes them and what they are. And so I would like to fight for rules that benefit the people and the customers and the workers and be involved in the process of writing these agreements. And I studied the fast track legislation that allowed this all to happen that expires, am I correct, July of 2021?
It is July of 2021. Yep.
Okay, yeah. So in that, it required that 10 members of Congress be accredited to the negotiations. Do you know if that actually happened and who they are?
I do not think that specific 10 members were accredited. I think that rather there are these sort of groups called the SAGON and the HAGON, which is House Advisory Committee and Senate Advisory Committee. I can't remember what the actual acronym stands for. And those folks, is more than 10. Those folks did get the ability ostensibly to be able to snoop in, but not exactly like the free reign of coming into every room that was sort of suggested.
Yeah, that's what was sold to us back then. Like, don't worry, Congress is going to be a part of this. And the other thing that really caught my eye were the dates and how this went through, because I'm concerned that even with the, Congress really gave up a lot of their power with the fast track procedures. And then when I look at the dates, the second version of this was signed on December 10th. It was submitted to Congress 3 days later. It came out of committee 6 days later and passed the House that same day on December 19th. This seemed to move quite quickly. Do you know if Congress had enough time to really consider all of the ramifications of this? Or was this another situation where they voted yes or no, not really knowing what was in it? Do you have any insight into how that all went down?
I think that there was a pretty good sense of what was in it. The reason it started to move quickly, though, is kind of unfortunate, which is at a certain point in the Democrats negotiating with the White House to improve the agreement, I think there was probably a little bit more that could have been achieved, particularly on the labor standards. But ultimately, Speaker Pelosi decided it was time to wrap up that process. And ultimately, she's in charge. She is the person who basically stood up and demanded all these changes and took a lot of incoming for a year for not moving the agreement, which was the right thing to do. She did the right thing. And then at the end of the year, she decided that just for a variety of reasons, not necessarily related to the Nafta itself, it was time to have this vote. So they ultimately got a deal from Mexico, the administration did, that agreed to a lot of the changes that the Democrats in Congress were asking for on labor rights, but not all of them. And that final deal basically got wrapped up very quickly. And there was a period of days where no one knew exactly what it was. It moved way too quickly for people to be deeply informed, for people to see the language in real time.
Yeah.
It would have been much better if it had been out there for weeks for people to become more educated. But by the time of the vote, it was fairly clear to people what was and wasn't in the agreement, because what basically happened is changes. There was a thing called a protocol of amendment. So there was the NAFTA 2.0 text, and then there was about a 35-page document that amended that and rewrote chunks of it. And so for members of Congress, it wasn't like they had to sit down with the whole 800-page text that for a year and a half we've been, reviewing with them what was in there, good, bad, and otherwise. Instead, they just had to look at did this thing get fixed? Did this thing get cut?
Okay.
On the balance, what didn't get fixed? Can I live with it? Is it good? Is it better than the status quo? I mean, the problem from my way of thinking of it was what was on offer, if only just the ISDS parts, but there was more, was better than the status quo. And unfortunately, what was on offer was not something good. So it wasn't like if you said no to the new NAFTA, you were going to have something better on offer. It just meant you had status quo NAFTA, and we knew that sucked rocks. So the judgment was basically, would some of the damage be limited, lessened, the ISDS cases, the outsourcing with the New Deal, even if it wasn't what you would call anything like a good agreement? And what were the other options? Oh, the other option was live with the status quo. Well, that's not a good option.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm thrilled. I'm shocked. My jaw has been on the desk ever since you told me that ISDS got killed. I'm just so not used to hearing anything good happening in these past 3 years. I mean, I'm actually happy that this happened because at least it's an improvement.
And it sent a huge signal worldwide because, here's the thing. Other countries, mainly developing countries, have been stepping out of ISDS and saying this is unacceptable. So South Africa, Indonesia, India, Ecuador, Bolivia, the big developing countries can get away with it. The really radical, now the governments have changed, but at the time, Ecuador and Bolivia, their government just said, we're going to do it. We're not going to live with this. But for a lot of other countries that want to get out, the threat of what the US or the EU would do to punish countries if they did was looming. So for the US to catch up to South Africa and basically say, hey, we want to join the club of countries that realize ISDS, very bad idea, we're out of it. That is a signal to countries around the world that they are also free to be able to get out of that outrageous regime.
But was this a US thing or was this a Trump administration thing? Like, are we actually sure that this was a change in policy for our country, or is this just another weird thing from the Trump years and then Biden gets elected and we go right back to ISDSing all of these trade agreements? I mean, do you really think this was a change?
Well, think about it this way. If a president who is a walking, tweeting, multinational corporation horror show sets a floor of no big pharma giveaways, no ISDS, labor rights and environmental rights for all the shortcomings. And that is what has been necessary to get Democrats to support an agreement. Even if you are inclined to want to go back to the corporate rights, and I know that's where Biden's heart is. He was for TPP incredibly passionately. How do you actually do worse for people on the planet and better for multinational corporations than Donald Trump's administration? Politically, the shame factor of that, I think, has probably established a new floor. Even if Trump was forced into making the changes he didn't want to, at the point of a Nancy Pelosi well-aimed stiletto, and even if the new Democratic president might not want to go and get rid of all those bad corporate rights, I think the cement's been poured. Now, whether other bad things could happen, like, the administration, the Trump administration is on the wrong side of these issues about limiting the regulation of the big monopolizing e-commerce platforms. That's a place where NAFTA doesn't do the right thing. The WTO could do the wrong thing. And who knows what a new Democratic president would do. But on ISDS and the farmer rights, I think we've got a new floor in place now. We'll have to fight, but I think it's an improvement.
I'm so happy to hear that. And then my last question is, how many of these are we still in? Like, how many of these trade agreements that we're already in that have the ISDS where the private companies can sue our government? I get that the WTO is government versus government. It's a little bit different. But how many of the companies can sue us deals do we currently have on the books?
Yeah. So relative to a lot of countries, it's actually remarkably, it's not as bad. It's bad, but it's not as bad. So we have free trade agreements with investor-state dispute settlement with Bahrain. We had it with Canada. That's now gone. With Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, the DR, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Korea, Mexico, but that got replaced, Morocco, Nicaragua, Oman, Panama, Peru, and Singapore.
Okay.
There's not a lot of incoming investments from those other countries into the U.S. So if we had done the TPP and had ISDS covering Japan, if we had done the transatlantic agreement with Europe and had ISDS covering all the European countries, we would have had 12 times the exposure to ISDS. But basically, Canada's investors are the main foreign investors in the U.S. that had ISDS rights. The new NAFTA takes it away. The new NAFTA eliminates over 90% of all U.S. ISDS liability in one fell swoop.
I love it so much. This was so unexpected to have good news today. All right, cool.
The way I think about it, the new NAFTA actually makes some progress, and it sets a new floor from which we'll fight forward.
I'll take it. Lori, thank you so much for spending this much time with me. I learned so much today. Is there anything else that you want people to know about upcoming trade agreements or anything you guys are doing with your organization? Like anything else you'd like to tell people?
Well, if folks found this information interesting, and certainly just, increasingly people realize if you care about climate, you have to care about trade. If you care about income inequality, you have to care about trade. If you care about food safety and small farmers, you got to care about trade. So much of what we all aspire to for the world we want is being undermined by bad trade policies, and the progress we aspire to can't be made without changes and having supporting trade policies. So if you want to get involved, go to tradewatch.org and sign up to our Rethink Trade action list. You'll get updates on what's going on with the new agreements. You'll get updates on what you can do to make a difference. And there is a huge international set of activists and organizations really fighting to get this right. Become part of the solution. Join Rethink Trade at tradewatch.org.
Fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Really look forward to seeing what you do with all of this. Blah, blah, blah. I went on and on. I'm sure you're going to make it great.
It was great just as it is. Like, I'm not going to have to do much editing at all. So,
okay. Thank you so much. Pleasure to get back in touch, as it turns out.
Yes. And next time I come to DC, I'll stop by and say hello.
I would love that. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lori. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
So, some relatively good news. That was unexpected. In these times, to hear from someone who knows this so well, that we've had an improvement in anything, finally. And I really wasn't expecting that at all. I mean, my questions were really aimed towards they fucked us again. Tell us how they fucked us. And I was really surprised to hear that it's better than it was before. I didn't see that coming. And I think that also goes to show that I guess one of the reasons I'm feeling so good about this is that it goes to show that there's things that are happening off our radars, and not all of it is bad, even though I know right now it feels like everything is bad. So we can still be pleasantly surprised, and I was. So yay. Although there is one thing, because I have to be Debbie Downer somehow, but there is one thing that I didn't get to talk to Lori about, but that I noticed in the implementing legislation that I do want to put on people's radars. The implementing legislation is the bill that passed through Congress with the fast track procedures that changes our laws to match the new NAFTA, to match the USMCA. Well, in this law, in the section that makes the changes to the investor-state dispute settlement process, it creates a new office in the Department of Commerce to carry out the dispute settlements. Because while it eliminated dispute settlements for us and Canada, there's still some version of it that applies, like Lori said, between us and Mexico. Well, the provision that has awakened my spidey sense says that this new office in the Department of Commerce that's going to carry out dispute settlements on our behalf, quote, shall not be considered an agency, unquote, for the purpose of the Freedom of Information Act. So the way I read it, secrecy appears to still be the default. And I don't love that. So I just wanted to make people aware of it. Other than that, though, I did look through all, I think it was like 90 pages. Yeah, 92 pages of the implementing legislation and the stuff that I understood. That was the only thing that really jumped out at me. I didn't see anything crazy. I didn't see any dingleberries, that like slaughters puppies or there was nothing too insane in there. And the bottom line, according to an actual expert, as you heard, is that this new NAFTA is better than the old one. So something improved during the Trump years. Yay! But don't you worry, my friend, who comes to this show for a good dose of depression. I'm going to get back to bumming you out again in March because we're going to finish up the defense authorization for 2020. And so the next episode is going to be all about Afghanistan because I went deep down that rabbit hole, something that I should have done years ago. And then we'll finish up March by looking at what our partnerships or beefs are with the rest of the countries specifically named in the 2020 NDAA. So lots of war in March, unless something crazy happens, and then I'll push off one of those episodes. You know how it goes. But the plan right now is war for all of March. And if you think that information is more important than, say, every burn made by a presidential candidate against another presidential candidate, especially considering that we all already know who we're voting for at this point, please support this work by donating using PayPal or Patreon or paper checks or Chipotle gift cards. No bullshit. I do love those. Or Zelle or Venmo, or I don't even care how much you donate, as long as the number is more than zero. Because seriously, the value for value funding model is a two-way street. I provide something of value up front and basically for free. You're not charged to get any of this. And instead of selling you and your time to companies, because that's what advertising is, I just ask that you, in return the value of whatever you receive in some kind of financial form. And so please participate in this business model, even if you don't mind ads, because this business model is what allows me the editorial freedom to say whatever I believe to be true, regardless of how rich and powerful the subjects of these often uncomfortable truths may be. And thank you to everyone who's already participating in the value for value model. You are so important to this project because it literally would not exist without you. And thank you, of course, again to Lori Wallach for coming on the show and for all the important work you are doing fighting for us peasants on the international level. And again, you can find her and her work at tradewatch.org. And so until next time, thanks for listening. I will have a thank you episode up for you. So there's extra stuff in there, but that's where I respond to your notes and comments that come in along with your donation. So if you want to be a part of that conversation, please donate and then we can interact in the thank you episodes. But other than that, thank you for listening to this main episode. I hope you enjoyed it and I will talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. With the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.